This is my great-grandmother, Nettie, and she had the sweetest voice. I'm from Chapel Hill, and when I say that I'm from Chapel Hill, I mean that the roots of my family tree trace back for 7 generations on both sides of my family. My family, the Masons, the Burnetts, and many other Black families in Chapel Hill literally helped to build the University of North Carolina, and some of my ancestors are buried on university grounds. My grandfather was a farmer of tobacco, and for many generations, we were servants to the powerful men who ran the university. We assisted their wives, and we raised their children. When I was in elementary school, we were given an oral history assignment to talk with some of the oldest family members. And my grandmother told me with her sweet, sweet voice about her grandmother who used to bring water to the Union Army, and that they would have conversations with her, and that they were kind to her. Now this was huge to me because of course I knew about the Civil War, but I never knew that a little Black girl could do her part to help with the war effort. And I thought about how brave she must have been to risk being beaten or whipped or killed for freedom. And then I remember thinking, she could be brave, I could be brave too. My grandmother's story made history come alive for me, and I could see myself in her story. She made me understand that my people were not just some, invisible observers watching on the sideline as history took place. No, we had history too. And this all came to a head for me when I was in high school. It was my favorite time of year, Black History Month. Well, more like Black History Day. But it was a day that we could learn all there was to learn about Black people. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, and George Washington Carver and the Peanut. But anyway, Julian Bond once said that what we know about civil rights history, we could say in 9 words. Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and everything was fine. So I was coming away from class, and I ran into 2 of my buddies. They were white guys, and we always had so much fun laughing and joking around, and I told them how much I enjoyed the class. And I told them that I would love it if a whole semester would just be dedicated to Black history. And these guys, my friends, they looked at each other, then they looked at me, and they said, "That's crazy. There isn't enough Black history to cover a whole semester." And I was livid. So I ran to my favorite teacher in school. He was a white man, and he was always talking about social justice and equity. So I said to them, "These boys said that my people had not done enough to cover a whole semester. Now you tell them it's not true. You tell them." And he looked at me with compassionate eyes, and he said, "I wish I could tell them that it wasn't true, but unfortunately, there really isn't enough Black history to cover a whole semester." Well, this time I was hurt and I was embarrassed. I was hurt because these people that I care about thought that my people hadn't accomplished anything. And I was embarrassed because even though I knew it wasn't true, I couldn't prove it. So it was on that day that I decided to go to the best HBCU in the world, North Carolina A&T State University. And I joined the history club and became an activist, and I joined a theater to find out about who I was in history as a Black woman. Now, after I graduated from A&T, I went to Virginia Tech, and I studied education, and I studied Black studies. Then I came back here to Chapel Hill, and I opened up an after-school program, and I incorporated local history into the curriculum. And each semester, I would start off, and I would tell the children about the wonderful things that happened in their neighborhood. Now, this was the 90s, and there was a whole lot of drugs and gang activity going on. And I would start and I would say to them, "I know you think you come from a bad neighborhood, but that is not true. You come from a good neighborhood, and you come from good people." And children in Chapel Hill needed that inspiration because although Chapel Hill has an affluent school system, it also has the second largest achievement gap between Black and white students in the country. You know, Cortland Cox once reminded me of a phrase that people used to say when they wanted to kill children's spirits. They would say, "You ain't come from nothing, and you ain't gonna be nothing." So if that is the expectation, why even bother to succeed? So I thought that if I could tell them positive stories about people in their lives who had made a difference, then they would understand that they had expectations of being positive people too. And that's actually how I got into documentary studies. I wanted to document all of those stories of the people who had contributed so much to our community. And I knew they were out there because I come from movement people. My mother and sometimes my godmother would go to the schools on their lunch break and they would tutor children, or they would advocate for children who were not their own in the PTA. My father was a member of the Chapel Hill 9. These were the students from the all-black Lincoln High School who started the sit-in movement in Chapel Hill. And many of my parents' friends were heroes to me in some way. I used to babysit Bob Drakeford's children, and he was Carborough's first black mayor. And I was oldest friends with Andrea Fashee. Now, her father, Braxton, and his brother, Titi, were civil rights legends in Chapel Hill. So I wanted to document and tell all of these stories. So I decided to take classes at the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke. Now, this was not an easy thing because by this time I was 40 years old and I didn't know what the heck I was doing. And all of those students seemed so young and they used all these hip phrases and all these acronyms that I didn't know. And they had money to buy the best equipment. So undaunted, I decided that I would double up on classes and I would hold soul food fundraisers to raise money for my equipment. Now, the soul food fundraisers, they were great, but here's the challenge. I raised $1,200, but I had invested $900, which only left me with $300, and the microphone alone cost $500, and I hadn't even bought my camera yet. So, like so many others, I get frustrated and I gave up. But years later, my friend Kirsten told me about a job that she saw, that she said I would be perfect for. Now get this, the Center for Documentary Studies was looking for somebody with an educational background who had movement experience to explore intergenerational movement building with veteran civil rights activists and today's activists. I could not believe how perfectly this fit into my life. So I was so excited to accept the job. And let me tell you a little bit about what my job entailed. My job entailed working along with Wesley Hogan with the students with the veterans from the Students Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And I was to do my part to help document their stories. And this method that we were using was called the Critical Oral Histories method. So I'll tell you a little bit about the methodology. It was developed by psychologists, James Blight and Janet Lang. And what the methodology does is it places key decision makers in the center of the research, and then it pairs that research with primary source documents. So people who were not in agreement with the decisions and people who documented the history at the time, they were also invited to contribute. And so what this really does is give us a better understanding of history, because what the focus becomes is why the event happened and not just what happened. Now, this methodology was later adapted by Jerry Augusto and Charlie Cobb to include sensory items such as photographs and music. And the really powerful thing about what these veterans did was that in their 60s and 70s, they took ownership of their history, and they presented this history to the universities. Now, this is not easily received, the whole notion of owning your own history, because it presents the radical notion that the people who made the history are the actual authorities on history, and therefore have as much, as Cortland Cox would call it, informational wealth, as the university who's sponsoring the archive. And so what this meant was we had to look at some of these antiquated release forms that gave all of the power to the university. And it also required that we establish a co-equal partnership between the academy, the archive, and the activists. So what happens when you get this type of equality is trust. And because we were able to get this trust, we were able to get new insight into historical records. And more importantly, we were able to inform the brightest minds that we have, our youth, and leave them breadcrumbs for the future. So back in Chapel Hill, there was an effort to document some local civil rights history. And the people who had started the history had a little trepidation about it because they did not feel that they were part of that archive. And some of the students who started the movement felt that they really had been marginalized and the story had not really been understood because, like me, they did not have the resources to tell their story. And like the SNCC activists, they felt that a lot of times people got that story wrong. So we decided to pair our research and use the format of the Center for Documentary Studies, and we went to our mayor and we told her what the issue was. So Pam Hemminger decided to get a task force. We established a co-equal partnership with the library, with our school system, and with UNC, who was able to provide us with some of the best minds in the country. And this was a phenomenal success. It exceeded all of our expectations. New information was uncovered and added to the documentary record. The vets were celebrated for what they did almost 60 years ago. And more importantly, our children in the school system were able to see themselves on the continuum of social justice. Now, this is an example of how young scholars can approach this critical work. This is also an example of what happens when we put equity in the center of our interaction. So I want to leave you with one more story. Our bathroom is adjacent to our kitchen in the house. And I was in the kitchen with my girlfriends, Irene and Gina. And we were talking, and my children were playing in the bathroom. My son Akeem wandered away somewhere, and my daughter Akanke closed the door. And a few minutes later, we heard this big thud, boo-doo-doo-doo. And I was paralyzed with fear. So I said, Irene, I can't move, go get her. So a few minutes later, she emerged from the bathroom with my daughter on her hip and blood everywhere, busted a lip, just bloody all over the place. And I said to her, Akanke, what in the world happened? And she said, I was trying to fly. You did what? I was trying to fly off the countertop. So of course, I admonished my child for being so reckless. But later on, as I lay in my husband Corey's arm that night, I said to him, baby, our little girl thought that she could fly. Now, this little girl who thought she could fly is an activist in her own right, partly because she was been able to be under such wonderful civil rights icons. She was able to be around Bob Moses and Cortland Cox and Judy Richardson and Jen Lawson and Charlie Cobb. And she was able to be around today's activists, Phil Agnew, Aja Bonet, Rebecca Barber, Kenneth Campbell, Sonny Osmond, Desmara Gatewood, Ajamu Dillahunt. And more to the point, she was also schooled by great scholars like Sandy Darity, Hassan Jeffries, Emily Crosby, Tim Tyson, Reginald Hildebrand. But she got her best inspiration, like her mother before her, from her grandmother. Until the lions have historians, tales of the hunt will always glorify the hunter, because the way that we tell and document history is a social justice issue. Because who tells the story and from whose perspective the story is told is at least as important as the story itself because of our ability to inspire. Further, if we say that we want to study social justice, then it is imperative that we put social justice at the center of our discourse. I want to thank you so much for sharing this time with me, and may all of your ancestors be the wind beneath your wings as you fly. Thank you.